Hi, good evening, everyone. A big welcome to today's Smart Nation in Conversation webinar. My name is Benjamin Chiang, and I'm a partner at EY. I will be your host and moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar is titled, Putting People First in Tech Design. Digital transformation is a key megatrend of our time. The current COVID pandemic and the circuit breaker measures have further accelerated the pace of our digital journey. Some businesses have had to adopt digitalization to survive. Others, who are more fortunate, have been able to exploit technologies to thrive in this new climate. During this session, we will discuss the rise of super apps and how predictive analytics and AI have helped tech to achieve a high degree of personalization for citizens and consumers. We will touch on hyper-personalization and explore the paradigm shifts to put people at the core of product design to stay relevant to the needs of end users. And we will discuss how governments and businesses have adopted various approaches to achieve user centricity and overcome the challenges faced. Joining me today are our very two distinguished panelists, Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, Minister for Foreign Affairs and the Minister in charge of the Smart Nation Initiative, and Dr. Patrick Teo, Director of Engineering, Payments, and Tech Site Lead for Google in Singapore. As background, this webinar is part of the Smart Nation in Conversation series. This is an initiative to engage citizens in critical discussions on Singapore's Smart Nation Drive. The series brings together panelists from the government, private, and people sectors. One key objective is for citizens to learn more about the thinking behind these initiatives and participate in the discussions through the Q&A segment. It is co-hosted by the Smart Nation and Digital Government Office and People's Association. Let me run through a couple of housekeeping points. This session is for an hour till 9 p.m. We have set aside some time during this webinar to address your questions. On behalf of the panelists, I would like to invite all participants to fill your questions through the Q&A function, and we will try to answer as many questions as we can. So with that out of the way, let's kick off today's session. I'd like to invite our first panelist, Minister Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, to give his opening address. Minister, please.
Thanks, Benjamin. We only have an hour, and I'm pleasantly surprised to see that we're the last count is what, it's 500-600 people online with us. So I'm going to keep my comments as briefly as possible so that we can have more time for discussion. If you look back at the last 6 months, this is an unforgettable period in our lives. COVID-19 has dramatically changed the world in a very, very short time and very urgently. But what I wanted to say tonight is that, in fact, the changes which we have witnessed the last few months, in fact, the trends did not start with COVID. These were trends and forces that were already evident way before the crisis. And in particular, the digital revolution had begun, in fact, years ago. But what COVID-19 did was to draw our attention and accelerated that sense of urgency. And I'm glad to see that Singaporeans as a people and the corporate sector, people sector, and the government have all risen to the challenge in the digital space posed by COVID. The government, on our part, we have had to develop a whole suite of digital tools, and to do so in a hurry to meet the needs, the urgent needs of our citizens during these times. For example, when the government was distributing masks, our GovTech engineers literally overnight developed a Mask Go Where website to enable our citizens to find the mass distribution points. And then when government rolled out in 4 successive budgets of various support programs of citizens. In fact, it was hard to keep track of all the support measures possible. And we rolled out the Support Go Where website. It was a one-stop venue where you could get all the information that you needed, accurate, well summarized, and well presented on all the government financial support schemes. Then, because of the need for contact tracing, we also developed Trace Together and a safe entry system. systems which in fact today most of us would use on a daily basis. And this enabled us in real time to improve the speed and accuracy of our contact tracing efforts. The point I'm making here by citing these examples is that there was an urgent need. We were able to rise to the challenge, but the only reason we could do so is because, in fact, we had prepared years beforehand, recruiting the engineers, preparing the infrastructure, educating our labor force, our workforce, and most importantly, our citizens, including those who would have been less technologically familiar. These years of preparation enabled us to rise to the challenge and deliver these apps and, more importantly, services quickly, urgently, and efficiently. The other point I want to make is that it must never be about technology for technology's sake, but we need to focus on the user experience. We need to focus on delivering services that people actually need and want. And that also means it's not just about adding bells and whistles, features, and other options, but to make sure it meets a need in real life. I'll give you another example. We all use Safe Entry now for entry to a variety of venues. And I hope you all use it, and you will realize that we provided multiple options to conduct the Safe Entry transaction. And we had to make sure people could do it even if they didn't have a handphone, a smartphone. But on the other hand, if they had a smartphone, if they had a smartphone without a camera, well, they could still enter a form online. But better still, if they had a camera, they had a QR code, they would be able to effortlessly check in. And then we decided that, well, if we're also using Trace Together, why not allow Trace Together to also be able to mediate that safe entry transaction? Then the other thought that came to our minds, because some people said, hold on a minute, I don't have a phone, or I don't want to use the app on my phone. And that's where we, again, very quickly developed this token, a Trace Together token. It's been made when we've started to distribute it, focusing especially on seniors and people who would otherwise be at risk of being left behind because they don't have the necessary hardware. So the point I'm trying to make with all this is to share with you the fact that this is a time of great change, a time of great challenge. Many urgent needs have emerged, but fortunately, because over the years we are prepared and we're invested, we are ready and able to deliver apps and services to people at their point of need. One other announcement I want to make today is many of you may be familiar with the app called Moments of Life. This is an app which, in fact, many young parents and maybe some seniors would be familiar with. It has been used, for instance, to register a baby when it's born. And currently today, I think about 7 out of 10 new births are registered through Moments of Life. But we've now upgraded it, enhanced it, made it more personalized, more convenient, more citizen-centric, and we've rebranded it today as Life SG. And I wanted to not only just make a plug for the app, and I hope you will use it and check it out for yourself. If today you try to open it, first thing you'll need to do is to update it. And what you will find is it knows who you are. So for instance, I've logged in on my own phone. It also has an idea of the services that I usually would use or that it predicts that I need to use. I don't need to remember the ministry. I don't even need to remember the name of the service, but it's personalized, it's relevant, it's convenient. And in a sense, ultimately, we want technology to recede into the background and instead for government services to simply be available on tap whenever people needed it. And the other point is the way we developed it. We went through what we call a service journey, where we actually sat down with real people and said, well, look at this app. How do you use it? How can we make it more convenient to you? And using this iterative process, refined it. So I would commend this app to you. And again, to make the plug that in fact, when we first launched it in June 2018, it was focused initially on families with young children. Today, as I said earlier, 7 out of 10 live births are registered through this app. We've also rolled out the Merdeka Generation e-card for seniors and employment support guides for job seekers also through this app. I would hesitate to call it a super app, although we are discussing super apps today, but rather to say this is part of an evolution of the delivery of government services using technology, but focused and customized on people as individuals and keeping humans at the center of all our developments. So again, welcome to our In Conversation session today. I'm looking forward to listening to your questions, comments, and having a wonderful discussion with everyone. So Benjamin, thank you again for giving me this chance. I look forward to, I think we're on next will be Patrick. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Minister, for setting the tone for tonight. Good evening, everyone. I wholeheartedly agree that at the heart of building digital services should be people. It's the same belief we hold at Google. When we build products and develop platforms, we remind ourselves to put users first. This is at the core of our mission to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful, universal being the key word. That means everyone, everywhere, and it's how we at Google envision the future of the internet to be. Digital inclusivity is a very simple notion, but something that requires a lot of effort to realize. This is why it's uplifting to know that the Singapore government has made significant steps, and as Minister mentioned, this has been years in the making towards achieving this for all Singaporeans. At Google, one of our areas of focus is the next billion users who will come online for the first time. They will come from countries like India, Indonesia, Nigeria, Brazil, and Mexico. Their right to access the internet and use its benefits to their advantage should be the same as everyone who has been online for a longer time. But we have observed that the next billion users experience the internet differently. This is where having a users-first approach plays a very important role. Before we are able to build products and offer services to help the next billion users, we have to understand who they are, what they need, how they interact with digital technology and with content. In the last 5 years, we invested a great deal of time and resources to spend time with people on the ground and to experience for ourselves how they live and use technology. We conducted research and collected insights. One of the biggest takeaways we had, which guides us in our efforts today, is that building for the next billion users requires building from the ground up. We cannot simply customize an existing product that was created in Silicon Valley. The functions must be purposeful, the designs must be deliberate, the product must be created with the intended users in mind. We have to start from scratch and give users something that's tailored to who they are, what they need, and how they live their lives. Understanding these principles have guided us in building Android Go, a mobile device operating system that works well with low memory devices, while still giving users a full digital experience. We built Google Maps offline, which allowed the next billion users to save places and directions in maps and refer to them later when they're on the road without an internet connection. And now Maps offline is used everywhere in the world. We've also made sure that Google Assistant works in many languages and have seen an uptake in usage in countries like Indonesia and Vietnam. With Google Pay, we've learned that to make payments simple, secure, and helpful, we also need to create value for the entire payment ecosystem: consumers, merchants, financial institutions, and governments. In India, we're humbled to be able to partner with regulators and banks to contribute to India's shift from cash to digital payments. We built Google Pay for India on Beam UPI, India's real-time payment system. And since we launched in 2017, or since UPI launched in 2017, monthly transactions on Beam UPI have grown almost 90 times as of July 2020. What's most important is that 2 out of 3 of these transactions take place outside of India's top 6 cities and across 300,000 towns and villages in the country. During the Singapore FinTech Festival last year, we announced that we're launching a new version of Google Pay for Singapore this year. based on 3 fundamental principles: making money simple, secure, and helpful. To make Google Pay simple, we too started by focusing on the user. Instead of designing around bank account numbers and transactions, we emphasize the relationships users have with people and businesses in our design. We want users to know exactly who they're paying: the friend who covered the dinner bill last night, or the hawker stall from which they bought their lunch. Users shouldn't have to worry if they keyed in the right account or phone number. We've been piloting this conversational payment experience with our friends at OCBC, and are excited that DBS and Standard Chartered will be coming soon. In addition to focusing on the user, we also focus on small businesses. The principles of people-centered design also apply to businesses. When the circuit breaker measures took effect earlier this year in Singapore, we saw that food establishments had to pause their dine-in services. This affected all food establishments, including hawker stalls, coffee shops, and small independent restaurants. Quick food pickups and door-to-door deliveries became a necessity as Singaporeans stayed home during this critical period. That's when we came up also with the menu discovery feature in Google Pay, where customers can browse menus, select items, and contact the food establishment to place their order and pay. Local eateries only had to fill up an online form, and they would be able to offer their services on Google Pay to reach more patrons free of charge. These are just some examples of how we put people and businesses first when designing products at Google. The internet is becoming increasingly diverse as more people come online. At the same time, it is increasingly an enabler and a gateway to opportunities. Adopting a people-first approach to tech design will help us build a more inclusive internet for everyone, everywhere. I want to close by thanking Minister Vivian and the rest of the Singapore government for creating an ecosystem where we can use technology and the internet to build and design products and services that will benefit all Singaporeans. Thank you.
Thank you. Once again, thank you, Minister and Dr. Teo, for your opening addresses. So let's start our conversation on the topic of digitalization. And perhaps I can direct my first question to Dr. Balakrishnan. Minister, before we dive into people-centric digital services, let's take a fundamental look at digital transformation. Going digital for the sake of digital serves a very limited purpose. Would you share with us what is the core principle that motivates every digital transformation initiative in public service delivery?
Well, I would start again by saying it's not about technology for its own sake. It's not even about just going digital for its own sake, but rather understanding what possibilities this opens up. I mean, for instance, if you think about it, we now live in an age where information, data is almost unlimited. In fact, there's more than what you can consume. And that's why, for instance, Google started off, I think you still use it as your mission to organize information, right? And if you think about that, there is a technical aspect to it, but it's really about meeting a need of human beings. There's one example. That's just organizing information. From the government point of view, it means there's a lot of information which we would also want to be able to deliver to people. And we need to find ways to deliver it and to remember that we now live in an age when there's an excess, a surfeit, an overabundance of information. How do you present it? How do you package it? How do you make it relevant? How do you tailor it to the needs and the interests of the individual citizens? That's one example. Another example, we know that digitalization means communications. The cost of communication. Most people make phone calls now, not directly a voice call, but they use services, WhatsApp, Google Talk. There's a whole variety of systems. But the point beneath is that we need to understand is that if communication is free, and whether you're on the other side of a phone or a TV or a monitor, or in fact, on the other side of the ocean, doesn't make a difference. Well, what does that mean for my job? What does that mean for the way I socialize? What does it mean for the way we organize ourselves as a society? Politically, how do we mobilize people? How do we get consensus instead of division, dissension, and hate speech, for instance? So another example where it brings both opportunity as well as dangers. Then, if you think about it, governments are supposed to provide services to people. I mean, that's why governments exist. What impact does digitalization have on government services? Whether it is environmental services, education services, healthcare. Let's deal with healthcare as an example. If you now live in a world where the patient can Google his condition and may sometimes be even more up to date than the doctor he's seeing, surely it transforms that patient-doctor interaction. Similarly, if people can book an appointment in a restaurant, they want to be able to book appointments and to change appointments in hospitals as easily as they do so in a restaurant. Patrick mentioned just now, well, if you've got Google Pay and you want to be able to look at the menu. If you translate that to services and the healthcare, people say, well, I made an appointment, I had my MRI, I had my test, I want to know the results. And I want to know the results now. Well, one little secret I'll tell you is that, in fact, if you've been to any government hospital and you have authorized it, all your results properly checked, verified, and assuming you have done all the biometric security on your phone, is available in real time. These are things which in the past, you would have had to make an appointment, see the doctor would have to look at the paper records and tell you. Today, that interaction is transformed, not just because of speed and the fact that it's available, but it must ultimately lead to better, safer, and as I said, more individualized care for people. So the way we approach digitalization is to say this is an opportunity to re-engineer the way government works, re-engineer the way we deliver services, make it more citizen-centric, and not just as a jargon, but in a very real sense of the word. And because in the last 5 to 10 years I was talking to Patrick earlier. I mean, he's an engineer, a real engineer. And I remember visiting Google once. This was more than 10 years ago. And I met a group of Singaporeans who were working there. And then I asked them why they're working there and are they happy working for Google? And they said, yes. And I said, why? And they said, well, we are engineers and Google values engineers. I remembered that thought, and that's why when I went home and said, well, we in government must also create a welcoming environment to say, if you're an engineer, a real engineer, and engineers like to do things, make things work, we must provide such opportunities. But because we did that, when the crisis broke out, as I cited examples earlier, you now have the people, the talent, the infrastructure, and the ability to quickly respond to urgent needs as well as long-term strategic needs. So I'm just trying to give you some examples that, it's not digitalization in theory, but in practice. It must recognize what technology has made possible. It must recognize basic fundamental human needs. And it must make life better, more meaningful, safer. There's one final part of it, and that's about jobs, jobs, and jobs. I believe the digital revolution is one of the reasons why there is anxiety about middle-class wages, middle-class jobs, and economic restructuring. Because in every field, it is being transformed by digital technology. I used to be an eye surgeon, and I can tell you within 3 years, an eye surgeon is out of date because the technology, the robotic systems that we use to perform surgery have changed. And all of us need to stay up to date, keep abreast with the technology in order to be able to tell the patient, I can give you the best care. So the point is, this is not something which only affects engineers or, computer scientists. In fact, digitalization affects all of us, ordinary citizens, people working in a whole wide variety of fields, hawkers preparing and ordering food, even clearing their transactions, collecting payments, and to make it safer and to make it more efficient, making our economy and our enterprises more competitive. So it's a very live and big topic.
Great. Thanks, Minister, for framing it that way and making it personal to all of us. I guess that the point you mentioned is that it hits us as individuals. And perhaps let's focus on that human element in digitalization. And I would like to direct this next question to both our panelists. As with any digital initiative, it must add that emotional and that human connection. And whether that's between citizens and the government, or perhaps businesses and your customers, right? So how far do you agree with this statement? And in your view, how easy or challenging is actually executing this, given that the internal organizational shifts, the change management that needs to happen? Some of us may have legacy systems. There must be a need to change of mindsets and ways of working. So how significant are these challenges? So perhaps I can get Dr. Teo to first share some of his thoughts on this.
I definitely agree that any digital initiative must add value. I think as Minister was apt to point out that technology presents an opportunity, and ultimately what technology needs to do is to improve lives and to improve lives. As far as the change management is concerned, ultimately we do know that all businesses do need to adapt and to innovate. The current COVID situation has definitely made this painfully clear. But in the meantime, the internet has become even more important for people. As I mentioned earlier, it's become a gateway to opportunity. Hence, putting people first in tech design is not just the latest product development approach. It involves, for many businesses, actual organizational and cultural changes. It has to be in the culture and the DNA of companies. At Google, we've always embraced this idea of putting people first in our efforts. One of our core values is to respect the user. And with that, we believe that if we focus on the user, all else will follow. And not just one user, but everyone. So during projects, when we start projects at Google, we usually conduct exploratory research. We do in-market immersions to better understand the user. I think Minister also touched upon this. And during development, we build prototypes, we do user interviews, and even after launching a product, we evaluate the final product by further surveys and interviews with users. And in all stages of a project, we want to make sure that the user's voice is part of the process and thinking. And we also want to make sure that it's a cross-functional team that gets together, engineers, designers, product managers to build this product for the user. So all of this is actually, fairly challenging. It's a cultural change, building up competencies. But I think, despite all of this, strong technical leadership, of course, is needed. But despite all of this, I think businesses stand to benefit a lot because, as I mentioned earlier, technology is an opportunity. And with that, we can use it to improve the lives of people.
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Teo. Perhaps can Minister to comment on this as well.
No, I totally agree with what Patrick just said. But let me add another dimension to this, because we talk about making services more user-centric, more personalized. But there's another dimension which we need to be aware of, because as I showed you just now with my Life SG app, and I said that it knows me, the thought must immediately come to your mind, well, what about privacy? What about security? And these are fundamental areas where government needs to think deeply and to make sure that the rules and regulations not only enable services to be delivered in a personalized way, but protects people's privacy and security. And events over the last few years, in fact, have illustrated the critical importance of this, because if people are not convinced that their data is protected, is secure, or that privacy is respected, they will be very reluctant to share data and use services in an optimal way. So this is something which we focus our minds, a lot on. We've had to build up our cybersecurity capability significantly again over the last few years. We also recognize that the way software is developed now in an iterative, agile way, it's never a complete finished product. But that also means you will continue from time to time to discover bugs or mistakes which need to be corrected. And you've got to correct it in an open, transparent way. Be accountable and explain any lapses if they occur. For instance, within the civil service, we have a bug bounty program, which Google has as well, right? It's a challenge. It's also a reflection of confidence in your own systems, and that there are people, good people out there, not in your company or not even in government, but who actually want to help. And if they find a vulnerability, they communicate with us, we recognize it, we rectify it, and it's an iterative process. The deeper, the more profound meaning behind this way of working is that, you see, the opportunities and the solutions transcend narrow corporate interests or even government interests. Everyone in society has an opportunity to create, co-create, to identify problems, to improve the solutions. And what I'm really hoping for is that it creates a more open society where responsibility, mutual responsibility, is shared. And that, I believe, improves the tone of our society. So that's another, I would say, intangible aspect to how we can manage this whole process of digitalization.
Great, thank you, Minister. Maybe a question for you, Minister. Singapore has certainly made great progress on many fronts on digital citizen services. And when I last checked, I think there were more than 100 government apps across the different agencies. You've got your Active SG, your Healthy 365, My Transport, and all of them perform a slightly different function specific to different domains of the lives of citizens. So the pace of digitalization is surely impressive. And you shared about the launch of this new app. I believe it's live.sg. You said that this may not be the super app, but wanted to get your thoughts. Is this app meant to be the one app to kind of replace all these apps in time to come? And also, I'm sure many in the audience today must be very curious about this new app. Are you able to share some of the key features of the app? What impresses you most and what stands out for you?
Well, let me just speak from experience. First of all, when my team comes to me and says, well, we've got 100, in fact, a couple of 100 government apps out there, I say, hold on a minute. It's not the number that impresses me. It doesn't mean the more apps we have, the more digital or the more efficient we are. It's not the number of apps. My next question will be, well, how many people use it? That's one level of a reality check. Next question is, well, even if there are lots and lots of people using it, what are they using it for? What is the feedback? And in fact, every year we regularly get feedback from people, what they're using it, how they enjoy, whether they enjoy it or whether they hate it or whether they're only using it because they have no choice. I say all this so that you understand it's not the proliferation of apps that we are pushing for, but quality and user centricity. And the other point, therefore, is that I also keep a completely open mind whether we should be having lots and lots of single purpose apps, or whether you go into a, what they call a super app, which does everything for you. I keep a completely open mind. And what I would like is to have an ecosystem where there are different types, and then let the market decide. Let people vote with their feet, or in this case, with their fingers, which apps they're actually using, and even within the app, which services they're using. And the other thing you will notice is that actually on each of our phones, our homepage or our sub-page is uniquely different. It'll consist of the apps that you use. And I think that's the way it should be. And then what we aim to do is to evolve according to the demands of our citizens. And even within apps, I will tell you that I also take a completely permissive approach. For instance, you need to park your car. And we've gone past the age of punching holes in paper coupons, right? But whether you conduct that transaction through the parking.sg app, or whether you use SingPass Mobile or LTA's app, I really keep a completely open mind, which means there's also the potential for internal competition between apps and departments. And I think that's also healthy, because every team that's working on the problem will have a slightly different perspective. To share with you an example, so for Moments of Life, and this was before my team briefed me, I accidentally found that, hey, I discovered all my medical records, my test results, which I found useful. Then I discovered, hey, even my child's vaccination records were available. But if you stop to think about it, it means the system had to know that I'm Vivian Balakrishnan. It knew who my 4 children are. It knew their ages. It knew that, and in the case of my youngest child, even the vaccination records, it had to therefore assemble a composite picture, because he would have received vaccinations over the last 14 years from many different places. To be able to assemble that, assemble it securely, and make it useful to me. So this is the approach. And I'm just trying to give you in real life my approach, my thinking process, and how I use and how I evaluate these apps.
Yep, thank you, Minister. That sounds really exciting, and I'm looking forward to downloading this new life.sg app. You did mention about commercial forces driving the evolution of applications, and maybe this is a question for Dr. Teo. We have seen the emergence of a number of super apps in the commercial domain, the likes of Alipay and WeChat, pulling together a wide range of services onto one platform, from messaging to social media, transport, e-commerce payments, right? And such super apps are able to integrate solutions seamlessly and provide that hyper-personalized service to enhance customer centricity. But most, if not all, of these super apps appear to be born out of Asia. So I wanted to get your thoughts. Could you share some insights as to why you think this is so, and why the uptake has been perhaps a little bit slower in the Western world?
Sure, Benjamin. I think we all know the most popular original super app was WeChat, and that was developed by Tencent. This approach has been emulated across emerging markets and by companies like Grab and Gojek, who are closer to home. I think what this points to is that there's a lot of entrepreneurial energy in Southeast Asia. In the recent Southeast Asia Economy Report, we've showed that beyond unicorns like Grab and Gojek, there's a wave of more than 3,000 startups that have received a total of $7 billion in funding since 2015. So I believe it reflects more of the wave of innovation in Southeast Asia. I think further to what Minister was talking about in terms of super app, the way I think about super app is that it's more of an app design approach that puts people first. And the way it does that is by aggregating similar tasks into a single app. And in doing so, it makes it easier for users to carry out these tasks, and also makes it easier for users to discover new functionalities. But like any approach, this bundling has to make sense to the user. And as Minister was saying, it's good to take an open mind and experiment and see, whether it makes sense to the user, because any approach comes with trade-offs as well. As an example, It's important to remember that Amazon first started as an online bookseller and then expanded to a bunch of new categories and now sells groceries on the same app. And if you track the history of Amazon apps, Amazon used to have groceries on a separate app and since then has merged it onto the same app. With Google Pay, we want to make it simple for users to make payments by focusing on the relationships users have with people and businesses. So we built a platform, which we call the Spot platform, that allows merchants to more easily offer services to users right on Google Pay. And today, movie theaters and food establishments in Singapore can offer services right on Google Pay. And the platform can be used for all businesses. And as such, I think the goal of super apps is not new. Instead, what it reflects is it's an approach by companies to innovate and improve upon the user experience.
Great, thank you, Dr. Teo. Perhaps you can spend a little bit of time to explore the current state of maturity from the standpoint of developing people-centric solutions. Minister and Dr. Teo, you shared about that experimentation, being agile, getting something out quickly and maybe adjust from there. So looking at the state of the digital services today, how does the public and the private sector measure up to each other? I'm not sure whether there's been any benchmark studies done. We talked about the super apps earlier. Are there learning points that the government can take from the private sector? Or is it something that the government and the private sector needs to collaborate more in order to deliver better people-centric services?
Well, that's a interesting question, and I'll just reflect from the view of the government. We watch what the private sector does all the time, because I know that in fact most times people are on Google, they're on Amazon, they're on WeChat, they're on WhatsApp, and it raises people's expectations. And they expect the government to be as responsive, as instantaneous, as customized, as helpful as private sector. So that's the first point, that the private sector sets a benchmark and raises expectations, and governments have to try to do that. That's one aspect. The other reason why governments have to keep monitoring and keep an eye open on the private sector is because, as I said earlier, regulatory issues of trust, of privacy, are the responsibility of governments. And governments need to understand the technology, need to understand the incentives, need to understand the private ecosystem, so that you have a right set of rules that protect people but do not stifle innovation, that maintains an open, level playing field, and yet leans sometimes when you need to against monopolies or abuse of dominant position. So there's a whole regulatory segment that we need to look at. And then beyond that, governments also need to look at the effect on society. And I mentioned that, because communication is enabled and is transformed. But there's still a difference between interacting anonymously online versus even in Zoom or even on these platforms, interacting with live video. And the quality of discourse and what people say online affects society, affects even democracy, affects the cohesion or the lack of cohesion of societies. So that's another area which we have to look at. And to be very frank with you, the whole issue of facts and where facts come into discourse, you're entitled to your own opinion, but are you entitled to your own facts, or facts which are not, or statements which are not based on accurate facts? So this is an emerging area. I don't think we've all got the answers to it, but it's an area that we have to look at. And I would say, therefore, that there is a role for the private sector, groundbreaking, but there's also equally a role for government. And I would conclude that a role for the people sector, because to continue to reflect the priorities and preferences and needs of people on the ground. And this is not just for something for Googles of the world to settle. It's not just something for the government to settle, but people have a big, significant role to play as we evolve this system.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Minister and Dr. Teo, for your sharing so far. I'm just mindful of the time. Perhaps we can leave the rest of the time for the participants' questions going forward. We have received quite a number of questions so far, so please keep your questions coming in as well. Okay, perhaps I can go to the first question that we have received. It says it's from Anton. Digitalization is a way forward, but we have seen many more apps are popping up. Example, Trace Together, SingPass, LifeSG. The question is, why can't we integrate and make it simple into one app? We had seen issues with payment, that's why we have the SG, the QR as well. So the question is, I guess, is it possible to integrate this further so that we don't have too many apps to deal with?
I guess that's directed at me. I agree that integration, streamlining, wherever possible, should be done. But as I said earlier, I have an open mind. I don't believe we will all coalesce into one super app, one super government app. I'll keep an open mind on that. And we will let people vote with their fingertips as to how they prefer to interact and use government services. So I'll keep an open mind on it. But your point about integration wherever possible and keeping a focus on how people want to use a system and what their needs are, that we will absolutely bear in mind.
Thank you, Minister. We have a number of questions that falls along the theme of catering to the needs of a very diverse citizen and customer base. Questions along how do we meet the diverse needs of a very broad social demographic base with people with different incomes, different age groups with very different needs, perhaps even the differently abled as well. Perhaps direct this to Dr. Patrick first. You mentioned about your next billion user. Perhaps it's something you can help to share more insights on.
Thanks for the question. This is actually really appropriate for this forum, putting people first in tech design. As I mentioned, at Google, we put people first in all of our work. And that usually involves including the user from the point of design, problem solving, and implementation. So our research at NBU, and we've actually, the program has actually been around for about 5 years, involved first gaining insights of these next billion users. So we have field trips and immersions into these countries to better understand. And we distill these insights and bring it back to Google and disseminate it to the various teams so that they have a better appreciation, a better empathy for these users. And we built out, I would say, best practices around how to integrate this information and how to use this information during our development process. Another thing I like to mention at Google is accessibility. So it's very important for all of the product teams. We have accessibility standards for every product that we have, and each product has to pass these accessibility standards before being released to public. So I think the question also had something to do with differently able, and so accessibility is a really large and important program in Google, because ultimately our mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And the key word here is universally.
Yes. No, I totally agree with you. And again, from the point of view of government, it is absolutely essential to make sure no one is left behind. No one is excluded from the digital revolution because they don't have a computing device or they don't have connectivity. And you will be aware that we have programs to subsidize computing devices, subsidized broadband connectivity. And in fact, the recent COVID pandemic and the circuit breaker, in fact, brought that to the fore, that for some families, it wasn't enough to just have one subsidized device, because now when the children are attending virtual classes, they need their own devices, and because they're working on it simultaneously. So we've also had to ramp up our delivery of both connectivity and computing, as Patrick said, in a universal sense. Similarly, even nowadays, when more and more people are mobile and they are interacting while they're on the move, we have wireless at SG, which we've also progressively rolled out in more and more public areas, so that you don't lose connectivity, even if you haven't subscribed to a very big data plan. There is still free access available to you. And you will realize we've also made it seamless access. And as you move through your journey, it almost doesn't matter where you are, you remain connected. But again, to come back to your point, it's still essential that we make the services accessible to people who may not be familiar. And this is where the question of design comes in. What always impresses me, I've got, now I have grandchildren, and even a 2 or 3-year-old can pick up a tablet or a phone. They can swipe, they can pick, they can choose, even before they can read. What that illustrates is the value of design, that it enables access, where people who are not even, in this case, toddlers who are not even literate yet. Now, similarly, for people who are disabled, visually or hearing impaired, again, technology enables us to create a far more inclusive society. And in fact, far more effectively and cost effectively than it would have been in the old days without digitalization. But pay attention to design, pay attention to the user interface, listen to what people are saying, and keep modifying and keep iterating the services that we offer.
Great. We've got a couple of questions coming in around the issues of talent and skill sets. I guess the question you talk about, design and iteration and building that connection. What kind of skill sets are actually required to develop really good people-centric digital apps and services? Is that something that's required beyond just technical skills? And I guess beyond that, do we have sufficient capabilities and talent in Singapore to create and deliver really good people-centric digital services? Is there more that needs to be done to nurture these digital talents, whether it's through our educational system or perhaps work study arrangements, or more can be done from a corporate perspective as well?
Should ask Patrick, what are the needs? What are the people whom you recruit?
Let me first touch on, I think you mentioned some of the soft skills beyond the technical skills of user design and software and product management. I think it's very appropriate then, and I've heard this during our conversation. We talked about empathy, we talked about experimentation. Actually, these align towards Google's design thinking principles, which include empathy, expansive thinking, and experimentation. So it starts with empathy. It starts with knowing who the user is and talking to the user and going out into the field to understand what jobs and what goals we're trying to solve for users. And I think what's important after that is not to hone in on one solution, like perhaps some engineers might do, but to have an expansive mind and to open mind, as I think Minister mentioned, and to challenge ourselves to have multiple solutions, to look at the problem from different angles, and then to say, how can we make that 10 times better? So we start with this broad, canvas of solutions. And then with the solutions, we use experimentation, we use, prototypes to test to see if the solution works. I think beyond the technical skills required to build digital products, empathy, expansive thinking, experimentation are critical.
Well, to give you my take on it, we are living in a revolution, a digital revolution. And during the Industrial Revolution, we said everyone needed 3 R's, right? To read, to write, and arithmetic. What about a digital age? What does everyone need to know how to code? Or even if you can't code, at least computational thinking. If you're an accountant, if you're working in EY, you need to know how to use a spreadsheet. Do you know how to use the formulas? Do you know how to set up models? I think a certain amount of core digital literacy, I believe, is essential today. As essential as the ability to read, write, and to count. So that's the first point. There needs to be core competence. Second, however, it would be wrong to assume that everyone will be a programmer, a coder. And let me give you the example. When you want to set up a new service, a new app, a new website, it's not just the HTML coding, but you need people who understand design, who even understand what color should my background be, where should my header, where should the important text be, top right, top left, whichever, what font to use. If you realize you do need an artistic sense, aesthetics, what works. And then you think beyond that, well, okay, so if I can have a nice website, but I still need to be able to communicate. And that ability to convince, mobilize, socialize, build networks. So my point is, you in fact need a team of multidisciplinary experts. It's no point having a team where everyone is identical, everyone is fungible, and it's just a block that you move around. You need a wide set of skills, which is why when we talk now about the jobs transformation and economic restructuring, it's not just about coders and engineers. You need artists, you need musicians, you need sculptors, you need people who can work with their hands. What the point I'm trying to make is digitalization will transform all of society and all our jobs, but it doesn't mean that all of us are obsolete. It's a matter of finding your strengths and seeing how those strengths are relevant in a digital age. If you can do that, there are jobs, there's a jobs galore. In fact, right now, frankly, we are short of people with these skills for a digital age. And that's why we've got Skills Future and all this whole, SG United jobs and training program. Because in fact, we can use this crisis, use this downtime to upskill ourselves and then to catch the wind when the economy comes back post-COVID.
Yep, thank you for that. I noticed that we still have a lot of questions that have come through. We probably have one last question that can squeeze in, and which I'd like to get your thoughts as well. Earlier, Minister, you talked about having access to view your medical records, having the information of your 4 children on the app as well. I guess there are questions around security and trust. What preventive measures are being put into these applications to make sure that we protect the sensitive information that is out there and that it is used ethically and for the right purposes?
Yeah, I guess you could ask Patrick that, or I have to answer that too. Well,
open to both.
As I said earlier, trust in the security of the system and the legitimate expectation that your service provider respects privacy is absolutely essential. And we take it very, very seriously in government. It is true that if you look over the last few years, there have been incidents, even within the government, where data has not been protected as well as it ought to be. And you see, when these incidents happen, we use every incident as an opportunity to learn. No matter how embarrassing, you need to have a proper after-action review. We will do so. We will learn the lessons. We will correct it. to improve the system. And to also know that there's no final solution. You have to keep, this is a constant challenge with hackers and people who are trying to, gain access, unauthorized access to information. So I'm saying we recognize this, we will invest in it, we'll be transparent, and we will continue to improve it. We have bug bounty programs, and if anyone can detect any, if you think again about my access to my own medical records, what does it depend on? The biometry on the phone, the SingPass mobile digital identity system, the system that operates across hospitals to build that composite picture of my results. And then at the same time to make sure that at the original repositories, that data is encrypted securely. And we have to resolve issues about how do we use the cloud in a secure way that they'll take a whole day's worth of discussions. But again, I'm making the point that we take this very, very seriously. And then on the case of on privacy, that I should not be able to access anyone else's records. And that every access is logged. And if need be, we can go back into those logs and check and query. And you will also know nowadays that it's not enough to have a log, and it's not enough to have just a human manually skimming through those logs. You need automated systems to check for these potential vulnerabilities. So we spend an inordinate amount of time on it, because I know that without privacy and without security, you can't deliver services. Patrick, I'm sure you face similar challenges.
Sure. Yes, we spend an inordinate amount of effort ensuring users' privacy and security, and we take this responsibility really seriously. The fact of the matter, though, is we do need data to provide services and also to keep users safe. So data is necessary to do these things that we do. We have revamped our privacy and security controls over the last few years. So if you've been using Google, you should have seen some of the changes. And these are, from feedback from government and from advocacy groups. The way we think about privacy is we focus on transparency, choice, and user control. If you look at your Google My Account, you can actually see every single action you've made on Google, and you have the ability to delete it or to download it. And we even recently launched the ability for you to automatically delete it after 18 months. So while we need data, I think it's the way we look at it, it's important to protect user privacy and security by providing transparency, choice, and control.
Yeah, I want to commend Google for doing that. I've checked those features. Though, Patrick, I'll be very frank. At one level, I think if you haven't, for all the people who are on our webinar tonight, if you haven't checked what access Google has on you, I suggest you do. Your first reaction will be shock that Google knows so much about you, your preferences, your purchases, your travel patterns, and all that. So the first thing will be shock at just how detailed your digital data trail is. The second point is that it's good that Google has also made it easy to delete. And I have to take it on faith that when it is deleted, it is indeed deleted for all time. But the third point is that Google also allows you to download that data. And it's a good reminder that if companies want people to use services and share data, they must also make it equally easy to take the data back. I think this is an ongoing public policy question, but I would put to the private sector that allowing people to transact on your platform and share their digital data should be accompanied by an equally easy way to delete or to take that data back, and at least have your own record of what data a company has on you. Frankly, the same considerations apply to Facebook, and people would also be may or may not be surprised at the extent of data which is captured. And although a lot of attention focus is on government for obvious reasons, but in fact, I think the level of personal data, which today resides in private company databases, is huge. And it is something which we need to be aware of, something which we need to think further, deeper, and to have more public discussions on. It's an area of ongoing discussion.
Thank you. I'd like to extend a big thank you to Minister and Dr. Teo for your time and very insightful sharing. We have reached the end of our webinar for tonight. I would also like to thank everyone for tuning in and joining us on your Wednesday evening. Thank you so much for your questions as well. I hope you enjoyed this session as much as I did. There will be a survey that will be sent to you, and we hope that you can take a moment to provide feedback on this event. Lastly, for upcoming Smart Nation in Conversation events, please do log on to the Smart Nation Singapore Facebook page for more information. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night, everyone.